The hangman wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. It was a chilly day in Falaise, France, in the year 1386, but this was stressful work. He adjusted the coarse rope of the noose, trying to get it just right. The neck of the condemned was unusually thick, bristly, and frankly uncooperative. Below him a crowd had gathered in the town square. They were somber, watchful. This was a solemn occasion. Justice was being served. The executioner glanced at the prisoner one last time. It stood there on the gallows, eerily silent, dressed in a waistcoat, breeches, and gloves, just like a human man. It stared blankly ahead, perhaps contemplating its crimes, perhaps just wondering when it would be fed next. Because the prisoner, having been legally tried and convicted in a court of law for a heinous crime, was a pig. A large, pink, and now formally dressed pig about to be publicly executed for taking a human life. This wasn't a village prank or a strange festival. This was the full, somber machinery of 14th century justice in action. So how in the world did a farm animal end up on the gallows, dressed like a disgraced nobleman on his way to meet his maker? To understand this, we have to go back a few weeks to a normal, messy, medieval afternoon. In the 14th century, towns like Falaise weren't exactly neat and tidy. There were no garbage trucks, no pristine sidewalks. Pigs were the four-legged, all-terrain garbage disposal units of the era. They roamed the streets freely, gobbling up scraps, refuse, and anything else they could fit in their mouths. They were a part of the scenery, as common as mud and church bells. But on this particular day, one of these pigs did something that shattered the peace of the town. According to the court records, a pig came across an infant, the child of a local stonemason, and in an act of aggression that horrified the entire community, the animal attacked the baby, mauling its face and arms. The child, just a few months old, didn't survive the encounter. Now, this was a profound tragedy, the kind that strikes at the very heart of a community. But in the medieval mind, this wasn't just a tragic accident involving a wild animal. It was something far more sinister. It was a crime. And in a world drenched in faith and fear, a crime of this magnitude couldn't just be ignored or avenged by simply dispatching the animal. No, that would be chaos. And the medieval world, for all its messiness, craved order above all else. This demanded justice. So why put the pig on trial? You and I see a clear line between humans and animals. We have rights, responsibilities, and legal standing. Animals, for the most part, don't. But in the 14th century, that line was a lot blurrier. Their worldview was built on a single, powerful idea. All of creation was subject to God's law. Everything, from the king on his throne, to the birds in the sky, to the pig in the mud, was part of God's kingdom. And if you were part of God's kingdom, you had to follow God's rules. This wasn't some folk superstition they just made up. It was a legal theory with roots in the Bible and Roman law. The book of Exodus, for example, states, "If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned." For medieval scholars and lawyers, this was a clear precedent. It meant animals could be held legally responsible for their actions. They had a moral agency. They could choose to do wrong. Therefore, if an animal committed a crime, it was seen as a disruption of the divine order, a rebellion against God's will. And the only way to restore that order was through a formal legal process. The animal had to face a court of law. But believing an animal can break the law is one thing. Actually putting one on trial is another level of commitment entirely. And the French justice system was nothing if not committed. The pig was officially arrested by the local bailiff. It was seized as evidence and locked away in the town jail, in its own cell, just like any human suspect. And here's the kicker. While it was imprisoned awaiting trial, the town was legally required to pay for its food and lodging. That's right. The taxpayers of Falaise were footing the bill for the upkeep of the very pig that had brought tragedy upon them. The wheels of justice, it seems, turn slowly and are surprisingly expensive, even when the defendant is livestock. The court appointed a judge, a prosecutor, and because every defendant has the right to a defense, a lawyer for the pig. We don't know his name, but some poor aspiring attorney was given the unenviable task of defending a pig against the charge of taking a child's life. The trial took place in the main hall of the courthouse. The pig was brought before the judge. Witnesses were called, including the child's grieving father. They gave testimony about the events of that horrible day. The evidence was presented. It was, by all accounts, a completely standard, procedural, and deeply serious affair. The stage was set for one of the most serious and utterly ridiculous trials in legal history, and the pig's lawyer was about to attempt the impossible. Now, what kind of defense can you possibly mount for a pig that has been caught, quite literally, red-handed, or red-snouted, as it were? The lawyer couldn't exactly put his client on the stand to plead its case. He couldn't argue that the pig had a troubled upbringing or was a product of a broken home. His options were limited. Historical records suggest that animal lawyers in these situations often tried their best, usually arguing for leniency. They might have argued that the animal was merely acting on its God-given instincts, and that it lacked the human capacity for moral reasoning. In a way, they were arguing for a kind of insanity defense, hundreds of years ahead of its time. The lawyer for the Falaise pig did his duty. He stood before the court and made his arguments, representing his silent, snorting client to the best of his ability. It didn't work. The evidence was overwhelming, and the crime was too horrific. The judge listened patiently to all sides and then delivered his verdict. Guilty. The pig was sentenced to be maimed in its head and forelegs, mirroring the injuries of the child, and then hanged by the neck until it was no more. But the verdict wasn't the end of it. In fact, the strangest part was yet to come. Because it wasn't enough for the pig to be found guilty. The punishment had to be a performance. This is where the human clothes come in. On the day of the execution, the pig was taken from its cell and dressed in a man's clothing. This wasn't done for comedic effect. It was a deeply symbolic act. To be punished under human law, the pig had to be symbolically made human. It was a process of personification. By dressing the animal up, the court was visually declaring that it was holding the pig to the same moral and legal standards as a person. It was a way of saying, "You acted like a monster, so we will judge you like a man and execute you like one." The pig was then paraded through the town to the public square, led by the executioner. The townspeople gathered to watch the final act of this bizarre legal drama. For them, this was a necessary ritual. The executioner was even paid a handsome sum for his services, plus a bonus for a new pair of gloves, so he wouldn't have to touch the unclean animal with his bare hands. The sentence was carried out, and the pig's body was hung for all to see. Justice, in their eyes, had been done. This whole elaborate, expensive, and bizarre spectacle begs one final question. Why? Why go through all this trouble for a pig? In the end, the trial of the Falaise pig was never really about the pig. It was about the people. It was about a community grappling with a horrific, senseless tragedy. The loss of a child is a tear in the fabric of the universe. It's a profound injustice that screams out for an answer. In a world without modern psychology or trauma counseling, the animal trial was their way of processing that horror. It was a grand public performance designed to restore order to a world that had been thrown into chaos. By putting the agent of that chaos on trial, by dressing it up and holding it to human standards, they were reasserting their own humanity and control. They were showing themselves, and their God, that even in the face of unspeakable tragedy, their rules still mattered. Their justice still prevailed. It was a way to take a meaningless act of animal violence and give it meaning, transforming it into a somber lesson about law, order, and the enduring power of human justice. Imagine you're a lawyer. You walk into a grand stone courtroom in 16th century Spain. The air is thick with incense and unspoken tension. The judge, a man with a beard so serious it looks like it has its own legal degree, stares down at you from his enormous chair. The prosecution is ready, a gaggle of stern-faced priests looking like they haven't smiled since the invention of bread. Everything is in place for a landmark trial, except for one small detail. You look over at the defendant's table. There's no sweaty-palmed merchant, no nervous peasant. Instead, there's just a simple clay jar, and inside that jar, clicking and crawling over each other, are a dozen locusts. They are the representatives for their client, a swarm of several billion currently munching its way through the entire region. And you're their lawyer. Your job is to defend them. This isn't a joke. This is a life-or-death trial, backed by the full power of the Catholic Church. So how in the world did a bunch of bugs end up in a Spanish courtroom, with their very souls, or whatever the insect equivalent is, on the line? To understand this, you have to understand the sheer biblical terror of a locust plague. We're not talking about a few extra grasshoppers in your garden. We're talking about a cloud, a living, breathing, crop-devouring tsunami that blots out the sun. 1 minute, you're looking at your beautiful green fields, the pride of your village, the food that will get you through the winter. The next minute, the horizon gets a little fuzzy. A low hum begins, a sound that feels like the world itself is vibrating. Then the sky goes dark. The swarm descends like a single, monstrous organism. It's a rolling carpet of clicks and chomps, a deafening roar made of a billion tiny mouths. They cover everything. The ground, the trees, the walls of your house. They eat the leaves from the vines, the grain from the stalks, the fruit from the trees. They eat the thatch off your roof. They will eat the splinters off a wooden fence post if they're hungry enough. Within hours, a lush valley that could feed 1,000 people is stripped bare, looking like a barren, gray wasteland. For the people of 16th century Spain, this wasn't just an agricultural nuisance. This was the apocalypse arriving for a matinee performance. It meant starvation. It meant watching your children go hungry. It meant the complete and utter collapse of your world. When your entire existence is falling apart around you, you don't just sit there and accept it. You fight back. But how do you fight a cloud? You can't stab it. You can't reason with it. Well, in 16th century Spain, you did the most logical thing you could think of. You sued it. Now, you might be thinking, that's insane. Why would they drag bugs into a courtroom? But you have to put on your 16th century thinking cap. For us, a locust plague is an entomological event, a product of weather patterns and breeding cycles. For them, there was no such thing as a random accident. Everything that happened, from a sunny day to a deadly sickness, was an act of God. The world was a grand stage, and God was the director, writer, and main actor. So when 1 billion hungry locusts descend from the heavens to devour your livelihood, that's not a random biological phenomenon. That's a message. This was either a divine punishment for your sins, or it was a direct attack from the devil, using his nasty little minions to torment the faithful. And in either case, the solution wasn't found in science. It was found in the law. specifically the church's law or ecclesiastical law. This was seen as God's own legal system on earth. They believed that just as humans were subject to God's laws, so was all of creation. The animals, the plants, even the weather. So if a pack of rats or a flock of birds or a swarm of locusts was causing trouble, they were technically breaking God's law. They were trespassers, vandals, and they had to answer for it. The stage was set for the most bizarre legal showdown in history. The church had its prosecutors, ready to argue that these bugs were agents of evil. But every fair trial needs two sides. The court couldn't just condemn the insects without hearing their side of the story. So who in their right mind would agree to defend a plague of locusts? Enter the public defender. You see, the court, being very serious about its procedures, couldn't proceed unless the defendants had been properly notified of the charges. So, a court official, probably the guy who drew the shortest straw that morning, had to perform one of the strangest duties in legal history. He had to walk out to the edge of the locust swarm, unroll a formal parchment scroll, and in a loud, clear voice, read the official summons to a field of insects. He would inform them that they were being charged by the Holy Mother Church and were required to appear in court. Of course, the locusts, being busy with their all-you-can-eat buffet, failed to show up. But the court had a contingency for this. If the defendants failed to appear, the court was obligated to appoint them a lawyer to argue on their behalf. This was a real, actual lawyer. Some poor guy who went to law school, dreaming of defending noblemen or wealthy merchants, was now tasked with representing a few billion bugs in a jar. His job was to stand before the priests and the judge, and with a completely straight face, argue that these tiny crop-destroying monsters were innocent. It was his sacred duty to give them the best defense possible, and believe it or not, the lawyer for the locusts came up with a defense so clever, so unexpectedly brilliant, that it actually made the church sweat a little. The prosecution's case was simple and brutal. A priest, acting as the prosecutor, would stand up and point an accusing finger at the jar of locusts. He'd declare them agents of Satan, vile creatures sent from the depths to punish humanity. He would argue that they were trespassing on land given to mankind by God himself. They were thieves, stealing the very food from the mouths of good Christian children. They were destroying God's bounty, and for that, they deserved the harshest punishment the church could deliver: a formal curse and excommunication. Basically, a spiritual eviction notice from the entire planet. Then it was the defense's turn. The locusts' lawyer stood up, and instead of just shrugging his shoulders, he launched into a masterful argument. He might have started by saying, "Your Honor, my clients may be small, and they may be numerous, but they are not evil. They are, in fact, creatures of God just like you and I." He would argue that God, in his infinite wisdom, created all beings. Who were they, mere mortals, to question God's creation? The locusts weren't acting out of malice. They were just hungry. They were following the natural instincts that God himself had given them. To punish them for eating would be like punishing a fish for swimming or a bird for flying. Then he would deliver his master stroke. He'd argue that his clients, the locusts, had a more ancient claim to this land than the people of the village. Their ancestors had been migrating through these valleys for thousands of years, long before the first stone of the church was ever laid. From a certain point of view, the humans were the real trespassers, building their towns and farms right in the middle of the locusts' ancestral dining room. The argument was so cheeky and so rooted in a weird kind of legal logic that the court couldn't just dismiss it. With the arguments made, the court was in a serious bind. On one hand, they had to do something to stop the plague. On the other, the defense lawyer had made a solid point. How could they rule against God's own creatures without looking foolish, or worse, blasphemous? Their solution was a stroke of absolute procedural genius and utter madness. The court decided to offer the Locusts a deal. They couldn't find them guilty, but they couldn't find them innocent either. So they issued a compromise. The court formally acknowledged the Locusts' right to sustenance, but declared that they could not exercise that right at the expense of the humans. Therefore, the church, in its magnanimity, would grant the Locusts their very own piece of land. They designated a specific pasture a few miles outside the village as a permanent locust reservation. It was a plot of land they could have all to themselves, to eat and live in, forever, unbothered. The verdict was formally written up. The Locusts were to cease their devastation of the village's crops immediately and relocate to their new designated pasture. And if they refused, if they continued to trespass on human lands, then and only then would the church unleash its ultimate weapon. The priests would march out in a formal procession with bells, books, and candles and pronounce the great anathema. They would be officially cursed and excommunicated from the Christian world, condemned as tools of darkness for all eternity. Imagine the scene. A procession of solemn priests marching to the edge of a field, holding up a crucifix and shouting complex legal jargon and eternal damnation at a swarm of insects. The church had made its move, a perfectly logical, legally sound compromise that respected the rights of all of God's creatures while protecting its people. They had offered the Locusts their own plot of land to live on in peace. But there was just one tiny, buzzing, six-legged problem. Spoiler alert, the Locusts did not pack their tiny bags and move to the designated pasture. They couldn't read the court order, they didn't understand the threat of excommunication, and the village's crops were, frankly, much tastier than the scraggly patch of land they'd been offered. They kept on chomping. And so, with a heavy heart, the church followed through on its threat. The priests performed the ritual, cursing the insects and casting them out. And the Locusts kept on chomping until there was nothing left to eat. And then they flew away, just as they always had. It's easy for us, thousands of years later, to look back at this and laugh. We see it as a bizarre, superstitious farce. Suing bugs seems like the punchline to a joke. But if you peel back the thick layers of absurdity, you find something deeply and recognizably human at the core of it. This wasn't just a group of silly people yelling at insects. This was a community on the brink of total collapse. They were terrified. They were desperate. And they were facing a force of nature so overwhelming that it felt supernatural. In the face of that chaos, they didn't give up. They used the most powerful tools they had at their disposal, their legal system and their unshakable faith, to try and impose order on a world that had none. It was their way of fighting back, of asserting that even in the face of an apocalyptic plague, human rules and God's justice still meant something. The story of the Locust trial isn't just a funny historical anecdote, it's a timeless snapshot of humanity. A reminder that when we're faced with terrifying, overwhelming forces far beyond our control, we'll do almost anything to feel like we're still the ones in charge. Imagine you're a monk in a quiet Italian monastery. Life is simple. You pray, you chant. You try your best not to think about how uncomfortable wool robes are in the summer. Your most important job, besides all the spiritual stuff, is managing the monastery's grain supply. This grain is everything. It's your food for the long winter, your currency, your safety net. You walk down to the cool, dark stone cellar to check on the sacks, humming a pleasant Gregorian chant. You open the heavy wooden door, and the chanting stops dead in your throat. It's a disaster scene. Sacks of precious grain are torn open, their contents spilling across the floor like sand. The air is thick with the smell of dust and something else, something musky and alive. And then you see them, a pair of tiny black eyes staring at you from the shadows. Then another pair, and another. The cellar isn't just a cellar anymore. It's the capital city of a sprawling underground empire of mice. And they've just thrown a city-wide festival at your expense. This isn't just a pest problem. This is a full-blown crisis. You've been robbed by a legion of tiny whiskered criminals. So what do you do when your monastery is under siege by an army of rodents? You don't set traps. You don't get a cat. No, you do something far more civilized. You hire a lawyer and take them to court. Now, why on earth would a group of holy men whose entire lives were dedicated to quiet contemplation decide to launch a formal lawsuit against a bunch of mice? For us, it's simple. Mice eat grain, you get rid of the mice. But for them, it was a profound legal and theological dilemma. You see, the grain didn't just belong to the monks. In their eyes, it belonged to God. The monastery was merely its steward. So, when the mice ate the grain, they weren't just stealing from the monks, they were stealing from God himself. This was sacrilege with a side of property damage. Furthermore, this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a widespread problem. In the town of Autumn, for instance, the local field mice were having a similar party in the barley fields. The situation was getting out of hand. The mice were seen as invaders, an army of tiny trespassers illegally occupying land and consuming resources that were divinely ordained for human use. And in the medieval world, there was only one proper way to deal with illegal trespassers who were breaking God's law. You served them a court summons. This wasn't a matter for an exterminator. It was a matter for the ecclesiastical court, the legal arm of the church itself. The church had to prove that the mice were, in legal terms, illegal squatters. And to do that, they had to follow the letter of the law, which led to one of the most ridiculous and strangely formal procedures you can possibly imagine. The first step in any legal proceeding is to notify the defendants. So, a court official, probably a very serious man in a very silly position, was dispatched to the monastery's cellar. His job was to stand at the entrance of the mouse-infested storeroom and read a formal proclamation, out loud, to the scurrying masses within. He would have announced, with all the gravity he could muster, that they, the mice of the parish, were being summoned to appear before the bishop's court to answer for their crimes of theft and trespassing. He probably had to do this more than once, just to be sure. Predictably, on the appointed court date, the mice failed to appear. Not a single whisker showed up. Now, in a modern court, this would result in a default judgment. Case closed. But the ecclesiastical court was more meticulous than that. They believed in fairness, even for their four-legged adversaries. The absence of the defendants was interpreted not as guilt, but as a clear sign that they lacked legal representation. So, the court did the only logical thing. It appointed a lawyer to defend them. His name was Bartholomew Chesney, a real and surprisingly brilliant French jurist, who found himself in the bizarre position of being the public defender for the entire rodent population of Autumn. He was about to take his job very, very seriously. And this lawyer, faced with the impossible task of defending a horde of unrepentant grain thieves, came up with a defense so audacious, so brilliantly pedantic, it threw the entire court into a state of pious confusion. The prosecution, led by a stern church official, laid out the case. The mice were a menace. They were destructive. They were thieves who threatened the livelihood of the good Christian people of the town. They had been summoned to answer for these crimes, and their failure to appear was a clear sign of their contempt for the court and for God's law. They should be condemned and formally cursed. A process known as anathema effectively evicting them from the Christian world with the threat of divine punishment. It seemed like an open and shut case. Then, Bartholomew Chassenet stood up to speak for his silent, furry clients. And he was magnificent. First, he argued that the summons was invalid. "Your Excellency," he might have said, "you summoned the mice of the region. But my clients are a diffuse and scattered people, living in many villages, cellars, and fields. A single summons read in the town square is hardly sufficient notice. Did you inform the mice in the north wall? What about the ones living behind the altar? It is a fundamental principle of justice that all defendants must be notified, and you have failed to do so." The court, stunned by this procedural cleverness, had to agree. They ordered that the summons be read from every pulpit in the affected parishes, just to make sure every last mouse got the message. When the new court date arrived, and the mice again failed to show, Chassenet was ready with his next argument. He stood before the bishop and declared that his clients were in fact too terrified to appear. He argued that the journey from their homes to the courthouse was fraught with peril. "Your Excellency," he explained with a straight face, "my clients are of a timid nature. They wish to obey the court's summons, but they dare not leave their homes for fear of their mortal enemies, the cats, who lie in wait for them at every turn." He argued that for the trial to be fair, the court must guarantee his clients safe passage. This meant the church would have to command all the cat owners in the town to lock up their pets. The court was stuck. The lawyer was, technically, right. The defendants had a right to appear without fear for their lives. But the idea of the church issuing a town-wide cat lockdown was so utterly preposterous that the case began to fall apart. With the legal proceedings tied in knots, the bishop and the court had to find a way out. Chassenet had successfully argued his clients into a corner. They couldn't be condemned if they couldn't fairly appear in court, but they couldn't be allowed to continue their reign of terror in the granaries. So, like in the Locust trials, they settled on a compromise. It was, in essence, a divine eviction notice. The bishop, in his role as both judge and spiritual leader, issued a formal decree. He acknowledged that the mice, as God's creatures, had a right to exist and to eat. However, they could not do so at the expense of the human community. Therefore, he officially designated a separate piece of land for them. The mice were formally ordered to leave the town's homes and granaries and relocate to their new, designated territory. He gave them a deadline. They were commanded, in the name of God and the Holy Trinity, to vacate the premises. And if they refused, then, and only then, would the church unleash its spiritual nuclear option, the curse of anathema. The gauntlet had been thrown down. The mice had been served their final notice, backed by the full authority of the church. But would a divine eviction order actually work on a bunch of rodents who couldn't read? Of course, the mice did not hold a town hall meeting, pack their little bindles, and dutifully march off to their new, less appetizing home. They stayed right where the food was. And so, the priests likely performed their solemn ritual, marching through the town and formally pronouncing a curse upon all the rodents within earshot, condemning them for their disobedience. The mice, unbothered by complex theology, kept on being mice. It's easy to dismiss this whole episode as a comical farce, a testament to medieval superstition. But it's so much more than that. The trial of the mice was a community's desperate attempt to impose its own sense of order onto a chaotic world. Faced with the very real threat of hunger and loss, they turned to the most powerful system they knew, the law. They created a grand public drama that wasn't really about punishing animals. It was about reaffirming their own place in the universe. It was a story of a landlord trying to evict a tenant from hell, using the only rule book he believed in. By treating the mice as rational beings worthy of a trial, they elevated their own struggle from a simple pest problem into a noble fight for justice, order, and divine right. Picture this. You're a citizen of Basel, Switzerland, in the year 1474. You're walking through the town market, maybe haggling over the price of cheese, when a commotion starts up near the edge of the square. A man is shouting, his voice tight with a strange mix of terror and disbelief. You push through the gathering crowd to see what's going on. And there, in the center of it all, is the cause of the panic. It's a rooster. A perfectly ordinary, if slightly bewildered, rooster. But next to the rooster, nestled in a small pile of straw for all to see, is the source of the horror. It's a small, strangely colored egg. The problem? That egg, according to its frantic owner and a dozen wide-eyed witnesses, came from that rooster. The crowd doesn't laugh. They don't scratch their heads in confusion. They recoil in fear. Whispers of witchcraft and dark omens spread through the square like a plague. Within the hour, the town guard arrives. They don't shoo the rooster away. They don't calm the crowd. They formally arrest the rooster. They seize the egg as evidence, and they march the feathered felon off to prison to await trial for committing one of the most unnatural and terrifying crimes imaginable. So what was it about this one little egg that could send an entire town into a full-blown satanic panic and land a chicken on death row? To understand their terror, you have to understand what they believed that egg could become. This wasn't just a biological curiosity. This was the key ingredient for a monster. According to ancient legends, a misshapen egg laid by a rooster was no ordinary egg. It was the egg of a cockatrice. And a cockatrice was basically a mythological weapon of mass destruction with feathers. The story said that if this rooster's egg were to be found and hatched, usually by a toad or a serpent, the creature that emerged would be the stuff of nightmares. The cockatrice, or basilisk as it was sometimes called, was the king of serpents, a grotesque fusion of a dragon, a bird, and a lizard. And it had a superpower that would make a superhero jealous, a gaze so deadly it could turn a grown man to stone. Its breath was so venomous it could wither trees and crack rocks. Its very presence was said to be an omen of death and destruction. It was, in short, the single most terrifying thing a 15th century peasant could possibly imagine. And the people of Basel believed that one of these apocalyptic monsters was now sitting in an embryonic state, right there, in their town square. The rooster hadn't just laid an egg. It had potentially created a ticking time bomb of pure, petrifying evil. This wasn't a matter for a farmer. This was a matter of public safety. The town's leadership saw this not as a superstition, but as a clear and present danger. But if they were so scared, why didn't they just smash the egg and be done with it? Well, that's where the medieval legal mind kicks in. And it is a strange and wonderful thing. This wasn't just a potential monster. It was a crime against nature itself. In the 15th century worldview, the universe ran on a set of rigid, God-given rules. Dogs bark, cats meow, and hens lay eggs. That was the natural order. A rooster laying an egg was a violent and shocking violation of that order. It was an unnatural act. And in their minds, anything unnatural was, by definition, demonic. They believed that the devil was constantly looking for ways to twist and pervert God's creation to sow chaos in the world. So this rooster wasn't just a confused bird having a hormonal moment. No, it was clearly a vessel for demonic forces. It had become an agent of Satan, a willing or unwilling accomplice, in a plot to unleash a cockatrice upon their peaceful town. This wasn't just biology. It was theology. And a crime of this magnitude, a crime that directly involved the forces of darkness, couldn't be dealt with by simply stomping on an egg. It had to be confronted legally, publicly, and with the full force of human law to restore God's broken order. And so, a formal trial was convened. This wasn't the church this time. It was a secular court with a magistrate, prosecutors, and all the trappings of a serious legal proceeding. But there was one crucial role left to fill. The rooster, now officially the defendant, was brought to the courthouse in a cage and placed before the judges. The egg was presented as Exhibit A. The prosecution laid out its case, arguing that the rooster, through its heinous and unnatural act, had clearly allied itself with the devil. The rooster, for its part, remained silent, occasionally letting out a defiant cluck. But the court, in its commitment to justice, decided the rooster could not be condemned without a proper defense. So they appointed a lawyer. Some poor, unfortunate soul, probably the newest lawyer in town, was given the professional duty of representing a chicken against charges of consorting with Satan. He had to stand up, in a room full of terrified and angry townspeople, and argue for the life of his feathered client. His arguments sadly are lost to history, but you can imagine him trying his best. Your honors, my client is but a simple rooster. He is not well versed in the scriptures, nor is he aware of the theological implications of his output. Perhaps it was a mistake, perhaps he was framed. He may have argued that the rooster lacked criminal intent, a key component of any crime. He couldn't have meant to lay a demonic egg because he's a chicken. He has the brain of a chicken. But this line of reasoning was no match for the deep-seated terror in the room. The evidence was clear and irrefutable. An unnatural egg from an unnatural rooster. In a showdown between a lawyer trying to apply logic and a court convinced it was staring down the barrel of a biblical monster, the verdict was never really in doubt. The court found the rooster guilty of an unnatural act, and by extension, guilty of being a tool of the devil. The sentence was death, but not just any death. A simple beheading wouldn't do. The punishment had to fit the supernatural nature of the crime. The rooster, along with its demonic egg, was sentenced to be burned at the stake. This was the same punishment reserved for the most serious of human criminals, like heretics and witches. Fire was seen as a purifying element, the only force that could truly cleanse the world of such a profound evil. A public execution was scheduled. On the appointed day, the town executioner led the condemned rooster from its jail cell to a stake erected in the town square. A large crowd gathered to witness the final act. This was a civic duty. They needed to see order being restored. The executioner tied the rooster to the post, placed the cursed egg beside it, and set the pyre ablaze. As the flames consumed the rooster and its egg, a collective sigh of relief surely swept through the crowd. They had looked into the face of chaos, confronted it with their laws, and destroyed it. The world, for a moment, felt safe and orderly again. So what can we make of this truly bizarre piece of legal history? It's tempting to just laugh at the image of a chicken on trial for its life. But the trial of the Basel rooster was never really about a rooster. It was about a community's profound fear of the unknown. They lived in a world they didn't fully understand, a world filled with disease, famine, and inexplicable events. They saw the hand of God and the devil in everything. When something as fundamentally impossible as a rooster laying an egg occurred, it was like seeing a crack appear in the very fabric of reality. They genuinely feared that something monstrous was about to crawl through. The trial was a ritual. It was a powerful public performance designed to take that fear, give it a name and a face, even if it was a feathered one, and then systematically destroy it. By putting the rooster on trial, they weren't just judging an animal. They were judging the chaos it represented. They were asserting their own rules, their own sense of order, over the terrifying randomness of the universe. It was their way of shouting into the darkness that no matter what, they were still in control. The year is 1314. You're standing in a field just outside the French region of Valois. In front of you is a hastily constructed gallows, its thick wooden beams stark against the gray sky. A crowd has gathered, their faces a mixture of grim fascination and solemn duty. An execution is about to take place. But as the condemned are led forward, you notice something is very, very wrong. There are no shackled men, no disgraced knights, no trembling thieves. Instead, a group of bailiffs, looking deeply unhappy with their jobs, are wrestling a thick rope around the neck of a bull. A very large, very angry bull, and next to him, another bull is being prepared for the same fate. These animals are the prisoners. They have been tried in a court of law, found guilty of a capital crime, and sentenced to hang. This isn't a joke. This is the king's justice, and it's about to be served to a herd of livestock. How did a bunch of farm animals end up as the main event at a public execution, with the full weight of the French legal system behind their conviction? To answer that, we have to go back to the scene of the crime. Imagine a peaceful day in the French countryside. The sun is shining, the birds are singing, and a local man is walking along a path, probably thinking about bread or complaining about taxes. Suddenly, that peace is shattered. A low rumble builds into a deafening thunder. The ground begins to shake. A herd of bulls, spooked by something we'll never know, is stampeding directly towards him. There's no time to run, no time to even shout. In a whirlwind of dust, hooves, and raw animal power, the man is caught in the middle of the charge. When the dust settles, the bulls are gone and the man has been, well, let's just say he was permanently removed from the census. For us, this is a terrible, tragic accident. A case of being in the wrong place at the very worst time. But in 14th century France, there was no such thing as a random accident. The world was a deeply ordered place, governed by two sets of laws, the laws of God and the laws of the king. An event this violent and this tragic wasn't just an accident, it was a breach, a disruption of the peace. The bulls hadn't just accidentally run someone over, they had committed a crime, and if a crime was committed, there had to be a trial. This wasn't just a quirky folk custom. This was established legal doctrine. The idea that animals could be held accountable for their actions was baked into their understanding of the world. Why? Because to them, everything in creation, from the king down to the smallest bug, was a subject of God's kingdom. And being a subject meant you had responsibilities. The bulls, by causing the death of a human, had violated their responsibility to live peacefully alongside mankind. They had broken God's law, and by extension, the king's law. And the only way to patch that hole in the fabric of reality was to apply the same legal process you'd apply to any human criminal. But before you can have a trial, you have to apprehend the suspects. And this led to a logistical problem of truly epic proportions. The local authorities were dispatched to round up the herd. This wasn't a simple matter of leading them back to a pen. This was a formal arrest. Imagine being the bailiff tasked with that job. You have to approach a herd of several-ton bulls, the same ones that just turned a man into a pancake, and inform them they are under arrest. The paperwork alone must have been a nightmare. The bulls were officially seized and impounded in a secure enclosure, which effectively became a bull-only prison. And just like with other animal trials, while they awaited their day in court, the town was legally responsible for their room and board. The local citizens had to pay for the hay and water to keep the accused killers fed and watered. it was the law. Justice, even for livestock, had to be served, and it had to be funded. The bulls were now in custody. The stage was set for the court to hear the case, and for a group of lawyers and judges to earnestly debate the criminal guilt of a herd of cattle. And so began the formal trial of the bulls of Valois. The case was heard in a secular court, not a church court, which shows just how mainstream this idea was. This wasn't just a religious quirk. It was state-sanctioned legal practice. The prosecution would have laid out the facts. On a certain day, these bulls did unlawfully stampede and cause the demise of a good man of the village. They had disturbed the peace and stolen a life, a violation of the laws of both God and the King of France. The bulls, of course, offered no defense. They were likely held in a pen just outside the courthouse, their occasional bellows providing a strange, ominous soundtrack to the proceedings. We don't know if they were appointed a lawyer, but even the most brilliant attorney would have had a tough time with this one. He couldn't claim self-defense. He couldn't argue that his clients had a difficult home life. He was defending several tons of pure, unthinking instinct. The evidence was undeniable, and the outcome seemed inevitable. The magistrates deliberated. The crime was severe. The public demanded justice. The verdict came back guilty. The bulls were sentenced to death by hanging. But just when you think this story can't get any stranger, the judge threw a legal curveball that reveals the bizarrely specific logic they were working with. You see, not all the bulls in the stampede were sentenced to die. The court made a very specific distinction. The investigation had revealed that the stampeding herd was actually a combination of two separate herds that had mixed together. One herd belonged to a man named Thibault de Sornay. The other herd belonged to the estate of the man who had been trampled, a man named Jean Lemarchais. In a stunning legal decision, the court ruled that only the bulls belonging to Monsieur Lemarchais' estate, the victim's own bulls, were to be executed. The other bulls, who had participated equally in the stampede, were acquitted and set free. Why? What possible logic could lead to this verdict? It seems to stem from a legal concept where animals were seen as part of their owner's household or familia. They were extensions of the owner's property and domain. In the court's eyes, the bulls from the other herd were just kind of there, swept up in the chaos. But Lemarchais' own bulls had turned on their master's community, a profound act of betrayal. They had violated the sanctity of their own household. It was a domestic crime, a rebellion from within. They weren't just guilty of ending a life, they were guilty of a kind of treason against their owner. It's a level of legal nuance that is both impressive and completely insane. With the guilty parties identified according to this strange logic, the sentence was ready to be carried out. The day of the execution was a public event, a somber piece of civic theater. The condemned bulls were led to the gallows. Hanging a bull is not an easy task, and the execution required special equipment and a great deal of effort, all paid for by the state. The crowd watched as the animals were dispatched, their bodies left to hang as a grim warning. Justice had been done. Order had been restored. The trial of the bulls of Valois is a stark and fascinating window into the medieval mind. It's easy for us to see it as absurd, a waste of time and resources. But for the people of 1314, it was the opposite. It was a vital and necessary act. They were faced with a random, terrifying event that stole a member of their community. In that chaos, they didn't just shrug and move on. They imposed their own system of order onto it. They took a meaningless tragedy and, through the grand theater of the law, transformed it into a story about justice, betrayal, and punishment. It was their way of proving, to themselves and to their God, that even when faced with the brute, unthinking force of nature, human rules still mattered. Imagine you're a goat. Life is pretty good. Your daily schedule consists of 3 main activities: eating things you're not supposed to eat, headbutting things for no particular reason, and taking long, thoughtful naps in the sun. It's a simple existence. But today is different. Today, you're not in a field. You're in a stuffy, wood-paneled courtroom in 18th century Germany. You're standing on a wooden platform, effectively the defendant's stand. A judge with a wig so large it looks like a frightened poodle is staring at you with immense gravity. A prosecutor is pointing a trembling finger in your direction, his voice echoing through the chamber as he accuses you of dark and terrible deeds. You look over at your owner, a woman named Anna, who looks even more terrified than you feel. You are both on trial, her for witchcraft and you for being her criminal accomplice. You let out a nervous bleat, which the court scribe diligently notes down as part of your official testimony. How did this poor animal, whose greatest ambition was probably to eat a priest's laundry, end up as a co-defendant in a witchcraft trial, facing the death penalty? To understand that, you have to understand that in his village, he wasn't just a goat. He was a suspect. This story unfolds in the 18th century, a weird and contradictory time. On one hand, you have the Enlightenment. The Age of Reason is dawning across Europe. Philosophers are talking about logic, science, and the rights of man. But in the small, isolated villages of the German countryside, older, darker beliefs still held immense power. Superstition and folklore were as real as the mud on your boots. And the most terrifying of these beliefs was in the power of witchcraft. In one such village lived a woman who, like many accused of witchcraft, probably just had the misfortune of being a little different. Maybe she was old, lived alone, and knew a bit too much about medicinal herbs. Let's call her Anna. Anna had a goat, a constant shaggy companion who followed her everywhere. And in a village where gossip was the main form of entertainment, this close relationship between a woman and her goat started to look suspicious. When a neighbor's cow suddenly went dry, or a child came down with a fever, the villagers didn't look for scientific explanations. They looked for a scapegoat, and they found 2, Anna and her 4-legged friend. The accusations started as whispers, then grew into a formal complaint. The local magistrate, caught between the old world of superstition and the dawning new world of reason, had no choice but to investigate. And the goat wasn't just a pet. In the terrified minds of the villagers, a goat was the devil's favorite pet. Goats have had a terrible PR problem for centuries. There's just something about their strange, rectangular pupils and their defiant beards that has always made people a little uneasy. In Christian folklore, the devil himself was often depicted with goat-like features, hooves, horns, and a goatee. The infamous goat of Mendes, or Baphomet, was a symbol of dark rituals and demonic worship. At the witches' Sabbath, the legendary midnight gatherings of witches, the devil was said to preside over the ceremony in the form of a giant, black goat. So, for the villagers, Anna's goat wasn't just a farm animal. It was a walking, bleeding symbol of evil. It was a familiar. In witchcraft lore, a familiar was a supernatural entity, a demon in animal form that assisted a witch in her dark magic. It was her servant, her spy, and her magical power source. So when Anna was accused, her goat wasn't just evidence. He was officially named as a co-conspirator. The prosecution's theory was simple. Anna performed the spells, but the goat provided the demonic juice. They were a team. And so, with a formal accusation made against both woman and beast, the full, bizarre machinery of the law had to get involved. The local bailiff, a man who almost certainly thought he should have been a baker, was dispatched to make the arrest. Imagine him parchment in hand, standing in a field, formally reading a warrant to a goat. The animal was officially taken into custody. It was locked away in a cell, possibly next to its owner. And, as was so often the case, the town was now legally and financially responsible for the prisoner's upkeep. Taxpayer money was being used to provide hay and water for a goat accused of being a servant of Satan. The trial was a serious affair. Witnesses were called to testify. A farmer swore that after Anna and her goat walked past his field, his prize-winning cabbage patch mysteriously withered. A woman claimed she saw the goat staring at her with unnatural intelligence right before her milk curdled. To the court, this was a mountain of damning evidence. The prosecution painted a picture of a demonic duo, a witch and her familiar terrorizing the good people of the town with their dark arts. The case looked grim for both woman and goat. The court was convened, the charges were read, and the evidence was presented. But even in a trial this bizarre, the law demanded one final piece of the puzzle: a defense. We don't know if the goat was assigned its own lawyer, but Anna's lawyer had the unenviable task of defending them both. And what can you even say? You can't put the goat on the stand to give his side of the story. You can't ask him to account for his whereabouts on the night of the cabbage incident. The lawyer's main argument was likely an appeal to basic common sense. He probably argued that his client's accomplice was, in fact, just a goat. An animal driven by instinct, with no capacity for moral reasoning, let alone the ability to enter into a legally binding contract with the Prince of Darkness. He might have pointed out that goats eat cabbage. That's not black magic, it's just what they do. He may have tried to explain that milk curdles sometimes, but he was fighting a tidal wave of fear and centuries of superstition. His pleas for logic were met with stares of pious terror. In their world, the goat's silence wasn't a lack of comprehension. It was proof of its cunning, demonic nature. It was refusing to confess. But this trial was happening at a strange time. A new way of thinking was sweeping across Europe, and it was about to have a head-on collision with that stuffy German courtroom. This trial took place on the fault line between two worlds. The 18th century was the era of the Enlightenment, a time when educated men in powdered wigs were beginning to question everything. They were challenging superstition, championing reason, and slowly pushing the world towards modernity. Witch trials were becoming increasingly rare, seen by the intellectual elite as embarrassing relics of a dark and ignorant past. It's likely that the judge himself was a man caught in this conflict. He had to uphold the old laws still on the books. But he may have been educated in the new school of rational thought. So the entire trial became a battle not just for Anna and her goat, but between two competing realities. On one side was the prosecution and the villagers, representing the old world of faith, fear, and folklore. On the other was the defense lawyer, and possibly a skeptical judge, representing the new world of logic, evidence, and reason. The goat stood silently in the middle, a furry, four-legged symbol of the entire conflict. He was the embodiment of the irrational fear they were trying to put on trial one last time. With the old world's fear battling the new world's reason, the fate of both the woman and her goat hung in the balance, resting on a verdict that would say more about the humans in the room than the animal on the stand. The historical records for many of these late-era trials are sparse. We don't know the final official verdict for this specific goat. In some similar cases, the accused woman was tragically condemned, while the animal was quietly released, the court being unable to fully reconcile the old law with a new, nagging sense of absurdity. In others, both were condemned together. But what is clear is that these trials were the dying screams of a very old fear. They represent a moment when the world was trying to shed its superstitious skin, but wasn't quite ready to let go of its monsters. The goat trial wasn't really about a goat. It was about a community's struggle with its own demons, projecting its fears onto the most convenient and most biblically appropriate suspect they could find. It was a final, strange, and tragic attempt to legislate evil out of existence, even if that evil was just a hungry goat who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time in history.